So there may be multiple ways up any great peak or mastiff, which is worth ascending in the most elevated sense. Um, One way to light upon something closer to the innermost core of the Heideggerian teaching, the penetralium or sanctum sanctorum, in such a way that instead of stumbling with the parts or the various signals, we would instead have sort of Muttersprache, um, uh, fluent language possession, and would then have, like Plotinus says, we would have left the innermost place of the temple and thereby left the temple images behind. Um, that has something to do with all these controversies about the iconoclasm and so forth between the East and the Western Church and so on. But the point being that fluency is like transparency, and it's a kind of readiness to hand. It's this more the Zuhandenheit. Instead of language, somebody speaks to you. If you know the language, you cannot merely stand back in a sneering manner and say, I shall not comprehend thou, or something of that kind, right? We understand language. So the idea being one would who played the role of those parties at the beginning of the Politeia who say, what if we don't listen to you, Socrates? Socrates wants to give an argument for passing back away from the Piraeus through the mile or so of walled lane back to Athens proper, and the other parties want to detain him and take him over to the medic or arms dealer's house to have some kind of discourse. And the idea is, if they don't listen to Socrates, then brute force will reign, right? So the transparency is never complete, because it's only the brute animal is not responding to the question of whether they'll listen to language or not listen to language. That would be the way I think the Platonic discourse thinks it. But with respect to Heidegger, to get closer to that zone where, again, I'll repeat that Leo Strauss says that reports that Heidegger said, Leo Strauss, who studied Heidegger closely and regarded Heidegger as the only living great philosopher in his time, studied Heidegger closely, and he reports that Heidegger said that nobody has understood me. So, and then the followers of Leo Strauss themselves say, well, maybe we don't, the closest followers of him at University of Chicago, and the people that really know about his thinking, they say, well, maybe we haven't really understood Strauss, which one does get that impression listening to him, because his way of thinking, as it were, is, I believe, the greatest factor is that it's, at least it can be stated this way with some, it's helpful in some way. This is one way into this issue, for instance, to say that the Prussian universities prior to World War I, and people that were in some way connected to that tradition, had a way of thinking which is very alien to the sort of the Quinean Anglo-American John Searle type of thinking. It's very, it's another belonging, another language. And Hannah Arendt brings that out in her letter to Jaspers, by the way, which I think is a wonderful statement that she doesn't know which one is harder, written around in the 50s or so, early 50s. She didn't know which one was more difficult to convey, even an inkling of what politics was to the German, or vice versa with regard to philosophy to the Anglo-American. I think that's a comment which, it's not that I'm attributing some great insight to Arendt, but I'm just saying what she's testifying to is of profound importance for understanding Heidegger, for understanding ourselves in the light of a different tradition, which is nonetheless still a European tradition and therefore not so far from the Anglosphere, and especially German is not so far from the Anglosphere. But the way towards Heidegger that I was trying to get at, which is maybe one way among others towards fluency in Heidegger, is this causality question. So I've been trying to get into this question in a larger sense. One thing I've noticed, I was thinking of this video. There's just as a little pointer in between for people that are interested in things like this. There's Heidegger goes into his own account of Aristotelian aetia, or cause, in the Athenian Greek sense, in amongst other texts, but specifically in the text on technology. I forget how that text is called. The question of the question concerning technology, I believe it's translated as. So that's just a reference if you want to look more into this, the basic subject matter of what I'm trying to approach. We're treating Heidegger as choice-worthy in his own regard, as it were, in a deeper sense. So something that, like Sir Edmund Hillary said of why did you climb Everest? Because it was there. But this implies not just, a lot of things are just there. So this implies a certain dissembling on Hillary's part. He doesn't want to. He raises the effect of his word by throwing off the track. And of course, what he means is not that there. I mean, there's any random thing is just there, but he's saying this is something choice worthy for its own. Uh, for itself. It's not that you can't explain it, in other words, and it's not comparable to other things. So, in this sense, the approach to Heidegger with respect to causality, I think, is one, to reiterate one thing which might get us more fluent. I was watching one of the older Guy Senstock videos where he was having a discussion with somebody who was commenting on, I guess it had then just transpired or was about to happen, the Jordan Peterson Slavoj Žižek debate. And he was, perhaps he was commenting also on, I suppose, there was like a 3-part debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. So, but he seemed to be fairly steeped in the thinking of Sam Harris. And one thing he said, which Senstock was sort of laughed this down as absurd. He started coming out and saying, well, originally the gods, there was some part of the population, say in Egypt, became aware of the cycles of the tide, or let's say of the Nile River. They became able to calculate things scientifically. And then in order to explain this to the common stupid mass, they invented the gods. To explain. And Senstock said that's the silliest possible notion, and nobody could believe that's the origin of the gods. So, but in connection here, one thing I want to point out, Aristotle. So Aristotle does say something like that in the 12th book of his Metaphysics, but why this brings us into connection to what I was thinking is what happens is prior to that epic where the Platonic lie would become, I mean, really the Platonic lie would be the same thing as Aristotle describes his forerunners for the last, say, 200 years since the time of Draco, since the time of Stallone, since laws became a big deal. They knew what they were doing insofar as manipulating their less educated, let's say, fellows. So there was some of that. There certainly was some of that, and it was known to Plato. And then Plato said, but this way of treating people, of manipulating them, of manipulating their ignorance and trying to trick them in this way, it could be turned around and used for the good. So you see that in, of course, in the Republic, but in the general spirit of Plato, I think. But here we are talking, here's the key distinction. So there's a distinction to be made between the Olympian gods. In Xenophon, there's an incident where Socrates just totally flips out this sort of countryman, country bumpkin, let's say, by remarking to him, well, wasn't Zeus a patricide? Or at least he cut off the genitals of his own father and so on. Isn't this just an outrage against everything holy? And so in this way, he kind of turned this guy into an atheist right on the spot. So, but these are the Olympian gods. So the Olympian gods are to be discerned over and against the cosmic gods. So what I was thinking is, so the cosmic gods are, like Gaia and Kronos, and Kronos being time, Gaia being earth, and other such forces. When originally, let's say, somebody would speak of the gods, and it's probably it's more complex than this. There's a crossover, so there's be some people that would be still trying to explain things through the old way of thinking, which would be genuinely trying to explain them under a new compensation. So take this, for example, like somebody will hear the lightning and they'll say Zeus, which means what? Zeus is the cause of that that lightning. Or there's an earthquake and they say Zeus. So it's convenient, by the way, that in German, this distinction is more clear between the Ursache and the Tatsache. So the Tatsache is like a deed, a human deed, and has something to do with the legal sphere, and then that gets translated as fact. Fact has the same history in English, but it's been very obscured and it's hard to show it. You can show it through looking at some old terms that are still in use, such as accessory after the fact, where fact is obviously an action of a human being. But then on the other side, the Ursache refers to causality, but it's the same word, Saka, so it's like something, some subject matter. And it shows the origin of the idea of cause, at least as causa, at least in the Roman sense, as a thing. It really means some kind of I think there's also a French word that approximates it better as thing. But this Saka, you can see that we're saying Zeus must. It's like usually when something happens, you can attribute a cause to it, right? And it might be it's hot. Why? The sun is out. The sun is unobstructed. So the earthquake, Zeus. But then there's be other things like I don't know. Maybe bad weather or something, like one day there's kind of a little bit bad weather, are you going to attribute that to Zeus? You might start to attribute it to some other deity. And then on other things, you might not make this sharp contradistinction between, uh, like somebody the other day said to me, how are you? I said, good. And I said, how are you? And they said, I'm well, bringing out that's more proper speech, right? So some people make a fuss about that. Oh, they don't know the difference between being morally good and being physically well, something like that. So supposing in the pagan world people really didn't make that distinction, like in the same way with this causal business, it's not clear at all that we should make a distinction between an act of justice, an act that belongs to a human being, an act that belongs to foresight in the normal sense, act that falls under the de facto, that falls under the legal sphere, right? And this other region of causality, which is worked out in various ways. If you work it out with humans, just like there's a sequence of images. The images have no particular status of their own, but we know their sequence. That would be sort of Humean, it's quote unquote fictionalism. Things aren't really what they are. So, I mean, that we can distinguish a shoe from gloves from a hat, for instance, that doesn't mean anything from the point of view of the sequence of images. That means only something from the point of view of somebody that has Platonic kinds in mind. So this question of cause in Heidegger goes back to the aetia, or the Aristotelian causes. We've gone on pretty far already just introducing the subject, so I can't go into the whole thing, but I think when he talks about the Angelius Silius, this, or however the name should be said, this mystical poet he's about the time of Descartes lived, but in the German speaking, Heidegger likes to quote this saying that the blossom blossoms because it blossoms, or something along that line. There's no because, it just it blossoms because it blossoms. No why. Sorry, I guess the formula would be there's no why, it blossoms because it blossoms. Something like that. So like the why would have to be something like Zeus, or something like this law of nature, or something. You put something in that place. But so what Heidegger's saying is, with this purest form of thinking, as he understands it, this mystical form of thinking in this sense, it just blossoms because it blossoms. We could still pick out, so look at this more closely, like nota bene. When we say it blossoms, we imply this sort of Kantian, still this Kantian level of there's something, a flower. So a flower should have an analytic definition to it. So we have to go away from the British spirit, where the analytic and synthetic have it. Analytic is like by definition, but this doesn't mean by definition in the sense that somebody can just through their power, in the sense of the John Austin book on language, can just, if they're authorized to do it, they can create a definition. But rather, definition is something like that's observed out of nature. So the definition of this feature of causality brings out, is left aside in the Angelius Celsius statement, no why, but nonetheless, the definition of the flower is still there. So like a flower is something that's alive, and it's something that's undergoing a process, and it's something which is in this regioning where blossoming is an expected thing. So the blossoming of the flower, it blossoms because it blossoms, seems to spill out into the other aetia of Aristotle, where Heidegger has a peculiar way of explicating telos, which agrees with the possibilities of uh, the etymology, because telos does have this sense of placing a limit on something, but it's, I believe it's idiosyncratically inclined in connection to how Aristotle has been understood. I'm not sure that nobody else applied it this way before Heidegger. So in the next time, we'll go into how Heidegger understands the four causes, and especially how he's understanding telos in a way which is almost like place. He's making telos into a region. So there's a region where the flower is blossoming because it blossoms. So we still understand that blossoms because it blossoms, but we've thrown aside anything like a thing that causes it to blossom, which is a being of beings like Zeus or like a law of nature. Zeus understood almost as a cosmic god, you see. So that whole transition would have been very a strange can of worms, right? Because you still sort of need the old terms to explain anything, and you've been used to talking that way all your life, but on the other hand, you're becoming aware that in some way this is an outmoded way of dealing with it, and also you're getting new things that you're understanding that you're explaining back to the more simple people, let's say, with the old apparatus. And Heidegger coming to the core of such a concept which is so basic, this is one of the, this is almost, it's like we're almost at the essence of Heidegger when we're sort of really thinking about what that means. Okay,